So thanks everybody for coming. I'm Keri Facer, one of the professors here at the School of Education. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Graduate School of Education Centenary Festival. Before I hand over to our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Prof David Clarke, just a few practical points. There is no fire alarm planned. If a fire alarm goes off, those are your exits. Many of you know this building very well, so you will work out how to get out of it. But in case of trouble, there are people in purple T-shirts who will be able to direct you. Second thing is Twitter. If anybody is tweeting, please do. We'd encourage you to use the hashtag GSOE Centenary, which is quite a long one, but you know, you won't have to type it after the first time. Practical stuff. In terms of sustenance, there's tea, coffee and biscuits on the ground floor, the first floor, and if you fancy views, on the fourth floor as well. In order to support local businesses, we're not doing lunch. So if you would like lunch, you will need to go out of the front door, turn right, and choose from any of the fantastic local sandwich shops and delis. There will be a break after the second session for that, or you can go in true festival fashion, although without the wellies, at any point you fancy throughout the day. Slight change to the programme. The second debate, Surviving the Century, will be in here rather than in 410. Okay, so that's going to be in here. So that's all the practical stuff from me. For now, I'd like to hand over to Professor David Clarke, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, for the formal welcome. Thank you, David.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Keri has said, my name is David Clarke. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor and delighted to welcome you all here to the centenary celebrations on behalf of the university. Apologies that the Vice-Chancellor can't be here. He has business duties in London, but I'm sure he would want to give his congratulations and best wishes for the day as well. 1913, the year before the storm of the Great War, was the time this school was founded. It became a formally constituted department of the University of Bristol at the same time as Chelsea Flower Show, but without the foliage, considerably less. But as much esteem, I think. It's really good to see a real mix of delegates here today. I've met a number of former members of staff who contributed significantly to the standing and success of the school over the years. There are obviously quite a few current staff that I know well here today, and students. Wherever you're from, whether you're a collaborator from another school, whether you're a researcher from elsewhere, whether you're from one of our partner organisations, charities, or indeed the schools in the area, we welcome you all today. It's particularly great to see those students and alumni and collaborators if you've travelled a long way. One of the defining features of this school over the years has been its long-standing international relationships from South America and Chile to Africa in the Gambia and across to Asia. And of course, it's impossible not to have a relationship with China these days. We look forward to collaborating with you all and appreciate those of you who have travelled a long way to be with us. It is a good time to be taking stock. We need to reflect, and we'll certainly be doing that in the first session, on the role of education and the schools of education, but not only within Bristol, but in the British sector. There are real changes afoot in the relationship between universities and schools, how we train our teachers, how we conduct our education research. There's real risks, I think, going forward. But this university and this school has had tough times in the past. I sometimes think of it with horror, have been at this university for 1/3 of its existence, namely 36 years. And I remember very vividly, as a young lecturer in law in 1981, in being told by the then Vice-Chancellor, who was facing the first of Mrs. Thatcher's cuts, that he was going to cut off limbs rather than seek efficiencies across the board, and the limb that was going to be cut off on the non-science side of the house was either law, where I was, or education. That didn't happen, and it didn't happen because of the community of scholars in those other disciplines who said, no, we'll take our share of the brunt. But it did vitalise both the law school, which was a bit sleepy, and the education school to become the great schools that they are today. We've faced that risk, we've faced others, and I'm sure this university and this school will triumph over the challenges that are coming our way. We're very proud as a research university of the very long and strong tradition that this school has, research-informed education, building links between schools and universities, and in doing the highest quality teaching and research. We've been combining research and practice to ask challenging, critical and blue sky questions for education in this country, and will continue to do so. And no one can deny that such research is vitally needed. So I look forward to hearing today about the new questions you're asking and the way you'll be approaching looking for the answers. So enough from me. I wish you a pleasant day and we all look forward at the school to collaborating with you and learning from and with you in the future. Back to Keri. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now to our opening debate. Just to set the scene, in this opening debate, we're going to look back over the last 100 years of education in university departments. We're going to be using Bristol's own archive as a resource to help us do that, and we're going to think forward to where the future might lie for education. I'm going to introduce the speakers now so that you get an overview of the picture. So Dr. Malcolm Reid has for the last year been working with Bristol alumni and staff and with our amazing librarians and archivists and some phenomenal people who've really kept the history of Bristol alive. To understand more and reflect on what we might learn from our history to inform our contemporary debates. Professor John Furlong, a former head of department here and until recently a director of education at Oxford. He's now emeritus professor there, as well as chair of the BERA inquiry into the future of teacher education. And John will then discuss his take on the future of education as a discipline, drawing on his latest book, which I think is essential reading for anybody in this field, and I would encourage you to rush out and buy it immediately. We've then invited two very important collaborators for the school to make some provocative or reflective responses in terms of where they see the future of education and teacher education going. Julian Baldwin, who's head teacher of Backwell School and who's one of our really important collaborators and partners for us as we move into a new era of relationships between universities and schools. And Dr. Kai Ren, a former student and now working on teacher education in China, will help us to look beyond the current UK situation and try to get a global perspective on what we're doing. We'll then hand it over to you, and I'm sure given the current climate we find ourselves in, there will be a lot to add to from this very informed audience. So I'd like to hand over now, please, to Malcolm to get us started.
I have a tendency to go wander about, so just be prepared for that. It's the teacher in me coming out. So, what are university departments of education for? I want to answer from the perspective of researching the archives in order to make an oral history film. The archive work was looking for examples to trigger people's discussion of people's perceptions of values of teacher education at the University of Bristol. If you like, getting to the soul of teacher education here. And it led to a day on Friday the 8th of March of 28 people, invited people, many of whom are in this room, reminiscing, remembering, recollecting, questioning, all of which was filmed. And you can see the film this afternoon. It's been shown twice. It's about 40 minutes long. After that event, we invited more people to try and develop some aspects of the film. People. Teacher education, departments of education turn out to be about people. Paul Thompson, the great oral historian, the father, if you like, of oral history, says this: unique often disarmingly simple, epigrammatic, yet at the same time representative, the voice can, as no other means, bring the past into the present. And its use changes not only the texture of history, but its content. It shifts the focus from laws, statistics, administrators, and governments to people. The balance is altered. People. So what are the values? What are the values that we seem to have found? Let's start with the notion of centenary. What happened in 1913? I'm going to refer to Darwin Humphrey's pamphlet from 1975, University of Bristol Education and Training Teachers. It's about the only history that we have of the early period up to the 1970s. What happened in 1913, to be honest, was an almighty row. I don't think that that row has actually completed or finished yet. What happened in 1913 was that, yes, the Department of Education was formed, that the previous teachers and tutors in the day training colleges were promoted to or given the status of university lecturers. Now, as they say in all good dance halls, rewind selector. What's happening here? Day training colleges. So there was something here before the Department of Education. Well, yes, just as there was before the University of Bristol, there was a University College Bristol, which was opened in the 1870s, get your history right. There was, from 1892, a Women's Day Training College, which opened in Berkeley Square. Now, that's a funny centenary. That's 121 years. We have to do some odd things with maths here to get this to be a centenary. If we take base 11, 11 11s is 121. So maybe this is our base 11 centenary. 1892, Women's Day Training College. Values. Well, this comes out of the Quaker and nonconformist tradition, as indeed did the University College Bristol, Haldane, the setting up of the university colleges. And if you go to the old council chamber, you can see on the wall the escutcheons above you, the shields, which represent the coats of arms of many of the people who were contributors to the University of Bristol. And you see there Haldane, you see there Lewis Fry from the Chocolate family, you see there a whole range of people. So the nonconformist tradition expected and wanted for women the opportunity to gain some form of qualification beyond secondary education. They wanted to offer people a university education and a professional certification. So the Department of Education has its roots in this notion of equality, of pushing people forward, of giving women more power in a society in which they still didn't have the vote and weren't to have the vote for another 30 years. What about the almighty row? Well, the point was that each of the day training colleges, there was a women's day training college, then a men's day training college, and an elementary department, had heads. And the heads did not want to combine. They didn't want to be a Department of Education. The then Vice-Chancellor, Isambard Owen, had to step in order to try to sort out this. And he argued with these heads of departments pretty well consistently for the next 6 years. The heads of departments were mistress of a method, master of method, and a head of department. The elementary departments, the secondary training department was which started in 1902, was headed up by somebody called Geraldine Hodgson. In 1916, the secondary training department disappears, and Geraldine Hodgson disappears. And the problem that the university had to intercede in was so difficult that it wasn't even written up in the minutes. So clearly, there's a huge issue that is raised here. What emerged, and as we've recognised, the 1914-1918 war decimated the male population, decimated the teachers and the numbers in the men's training college. So something was happening which meant that we needed a new form of leadership. We needed a new form of structure. And out of this, two things emerged which were really important. One was the notion of the 4-year course. And it's the 4-year course in teacher education that we still have to this day. Originally, it was the same notion of 3 years teaching a subject or being taught a subject, developing your subject, and then a 1-year completion. That's sort of equivalent and didn't really change until the 1950s in any university. That's equivalent to doing your degree and then getting your postgraduate certificate. Okay? Alongside that, there was a 2-year course which was developed more for primary school teachers and was very successful and kind of carried on until the 1930s, but finished really about the end of the First World War. So the development of the 4-year course. The other important thing, which was what Sir Isam Baldwin tried to get to happen in 1913, was the appointment of a professor of education. And the professor of education was Helen Woodhouse, and Helen Woodhouse is the name of this building, the Helen Woodhouse building, which was opened in 1966. Helen Woodhouse was the first woman professor in this university of any subject. Helen Woodhouse came in 1919, was appointed in 1919, actually arrived in 1920. Within 2 years, she also inherited this argument that maintained itself between the men's college and the women's college, between the Mistress of Method and the Master of Method. And it's not at all certain that she ever solved this, except that she has 2 great things in her legacy. The first is that in 1922, she corresponded with the Department for Education, and she argued for continuous assessment. 1922, continuous assessment for initial teacher trainers initial teacher training students in their final year. So do away with exams and bring in a notion of continuous assessment, which involved all kinds of books and notebooks and observation books and records of lessons. In fact, developed the kind of structure, if you like, for observation and practice and reflection, which continues to this day. So I think that we should be celebrating that value of continuous assessment, that value of recognising that practice is incredibly important. In 1923, the University of Bristol produced a pamphlet. Actually, it says the University of the West, Bristol. This is the University of the West in Bristol. And that gives us another notion that I think is important, another value, and that's of localism, of regionalism. This is a university for the West of England. In this pamphlet, fascinating pamphlet, what's very, very clear is the university's engagement with professionalism. This is a university which prides itself on the training of professionals, its law department, its engineering department, its hard sciences, its geographical sciences, its school of medicine, its veterinary sciences, its teacher training, its social work. All of those are represented in this photographic archive. So professionalism, a university of the West that is dedicated to professionalism. Okay, so devastating HMI inspection in 1919. Yes, there were still inspections even in 1919. This was devastating because it recognised that the infrastructure, the care, the support for students was not fit for purpose. There needed to be new buildings, there needed to be new quality of life for students, teachers. It also saw the end of the mistress of methods, Marion Pease, who retired. Marion Pease was a formidable and important figure, and Claire Davey in the film argues very appropriately that we remember Helen Woodhouse and we forget Marion Pease. Marion Pease continued to open her house and look after students, often funding from her own purse, women students, right up through the 1920s and 1930s, long after she had retired. Marion Pease had that notion of care and responsibility for people, which I think is also a value that we need to honour. So, in 1931, Helen Woodhouse becomes the mistress of Girton College, Cambridge. And in a way, we have the development by this time of what we would recognise. If you go to the archives, you begin to recognise the structure of the programme in terms of teacher education. You begin to recognise the schools that students are being placed in. And many of those schools are still the same schools today, in the same area. Not so much South Wales, and I was thinking about this until I realised that, of course, the bridge wasn't built until, I think, 1968, so it's quite difficult to get to South Wales. But very much Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, Somerset, City of Bristol. So again, regionalism, strong contact with schools, and strong voices from schools, strong voices of partnership, right back to the 1920s. So the argument came about what form of teaching practice was most appropriate. Would it be a point where students go out to schools for a week throughout the year? Would it be a kind of point where they went out for 2 or 4 days of the week and that they came back to the university for 1 day of the week? No, said all of the heads. No, by far the best and most appropriate form for the main practice is that students spend a whole term, the spring term, in schools, and that they have other practices beside. And that remains the model at Bristol to this day. If you've ever examined initial teacher education anywhere else, you realise that there are all kinds of different models. But what is central to the Bristol model is that people go out after Christmas and they spend an intensive whole term in school. In fact, nowadays they spend 2/3 of their time in schools. So partnership, strong connections with schools, and a voice from schools which organises the way in which teacher training happens. You'll notice that I've talked nearly exclusively about initial teacher education, about teacher training. What is the University of Department of Education for? Well, historically, for initial teacher education, for training teachers. It's not until the 1940s, another incredibly important Vice-Chancellor for the University of Bristol, Sir Philip Morris, who has a real engagement with education, not just university education, but educational development across the country, and comes from a background, a liberal background in a way, which argues very, very powerfully for opportunity, the development of education, and the centrality of education, of teaching within a university. What also happens in the 1940s is the Mcnair Committee, and this runs really from 1942 to 1946. The Mcnair Committee develops another sense of region, what becomes known as the Area Training Organisation. So Bristol becomes the Institute of Education. The Institute of Education of Bristol. And it oversees all of what become later colleges of education. So all of the places in which teacher education happens have to, well, don't have to. It's not a kind of controlling relationship. It's a collective relationship. So pretty well everywhere that you see as a university around you nowadays, the University of West of England, Redland College, the University of Bath, which was formed on the basis of the old teacher training college, the University of Bath Spa, the University of Gloucester, the University of Exeter at St Luke's. All of these universities were originally teacher training colleges. And they developed out of that kind of centre. And the Institute for Education at Bristol managed and helped people to work out their area responsibilities in relation to teacher education. Had there been any higher degree work, master's level? Well, yes. I mean, from the 1920s and 1930s, you could gain a master's at the University of Bristol, but it was a master's by thesis. So you were given, much as you would be in PhD studies up until recently, you would be simply supervised in relation to a project. From the 1940s onwards, this begins to change. So you have the rise of professional studies, the rise of higher degrees, the rise of research. So if we're to look at what we consider a Department for Education to be in 2013, we need really to look back to the Mcnair Committee, Philip Morris, the Institute of Education, and this development, this flowering into a range of different responsibilities. So we have a triple sense of teacher education. Teacher education as initial, further professional studies and higher degrees, and research. Okay, so I'm just going to read you some developments from the 1950s through to the 1970s so that you can begin to see how this moved and formed. We had here a head of the Institute of Education called Basil Fletcher, Professor Basil Fletcher. He had a strong connection with East Africa. He left to become a professor of education in Nyasaland. So one of the long relationships of the Graduate School of Education is with East Africa. And that goes back to Basil Fletcher's influence from the 1940s and early 1950s. From 1951, we began to offer diploma courses. So diploma courses was a way in which you could kind of top up beyond your teacher training qualification. And everything became one-year courses only, so we dispensed with the 3-year. We had the struggles for independence, so the relationship between the former colonies and Bristol becomes very apparent in the 1950s and the 1960s. And what's fascinating in the film is the regard with which Bristol is held and continues to be held through all of those turbulent times and periods, right through the 50s and 60s and 70s. People still come to Bristol, still enjoy being at Bristol. We have the first permanent Bristol Research Unit, only one in 4 in the United Kingdom, in 1963. In 1963, we have the Robbins Report, which turned colleges, training colleges, into colleges of education, and thus started the process of the expansion into our regional universities. In 1965, we had the first course for the degree of Master in Education. In 1966, we moved from Royal Fort House to Berkeley Square. In 1969, we had a school and faculty with 3 divisions, a postgraduate certificate division, a colleges and further professional studies division, and an advanced studies division. I'm not quite certain where research locates itself within that, but clearly there's an important relationship, probably because I suspect that the research unit continues. In 1972, we have the James Committee, and this removes the area training organisation. This breaks up this notion of the regional area, and there are lots and lots of consequences of this, not least that the colleges of education become able to offer certification and qualification themselves, and to do this through the Council for the National Academic Awards. And then we move into the great expansion times of education, the point at which it was possible, like I had my fees paid to do a master's by the London Borough, or the Inner London Education Authority at that time. It was a time in which teachers, and many people in this room I suspect, benefited from further professional studies, from government support, from grants, which allowed them to move from a professional sphere in teaching to become educators and university educators. So, okay, to finish, values. Values, they've got to be clear. Old pedantic English teacher, I was going to say we spell clear C-L-E-A-R, and then I realised you can only spell clear C-L-E-A-R, certainly since about the 1500s. Anyway, so clear, C, and I've based this on the root words in the Oxford English Dictionary. Criticality, the root sense of being able to intervene in a crisis, a medical crisis. So research is a critical venture involving creativity and change, and sometimes a deliberate stance against the trend or the community held or the dictated assumption. Local, our place, our situation. Partnership, responding to regional and local educational priorities. E, entrepreneurial, one who undertakes, a manager, controller, champion. How do we create opportunities? How do we champion opportunities in education in a principled manner? Aspirational, A, the act of breathing into inspiration, the activity that creates the passion and the imagination to do education. And R, finally, reflexivity, capable of turning, deflecting, or bending something back. The ability to position ourselves successfully in relation to changing governmental edicts, particularly regarding teacher training, certification, and development. The future, at least at the moment, is clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. And if anything, that teaches us that the battles that you fight have a very long legacy. John, I'd like to invite you to come and follow on, please. There you go.
Lovely. Well, first of all, I want to say how wonderful it is to be back here. I've come snuck in the back door a few times since I left in 2001. But this is the first time I've actually come back formally. It's actually a delight to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me, Keri. And it's very good to see some old friends here. I want to talk a little bit about education as a discipline. And to begin, and it covers some of the ground that Malcolm's been talking about, but on a national scale, and then talks very much about the current situation, what we ought to be doing as the discipline of education. Is it a discipline? Well, there are two ways of asking that question. You can ask it epistemologically, and you can ask it sociologically. If you ask the question epistemologically, you're asking questions about research methods, about the nature of evidence, about research topics, and clearly education is not a discipline at all. We cover everything from early years to lifelong learning and everything in between. We use every single research method going, or none, and we use every single theory going, or none at all. We are a field. But there is another way of asking the question about a discipline, and that's to say we can ask the question sociologically. And it is quite clear that if you ask, is education a discipline sociologically, it exists. It exists in qualifications, it exists in buildings, it exists in learner societies, in professorships and lectureships, in students' qualifications. It's an incredibly rich and dynamic field, and it is a discipline from that point of view, sociologically. One of the advantages of asking the question sociologically is that you start to recognize that disciplines don't have some abstract existence. They are struggled for, they're fought for, they advance and they go back. We just heard some of that history here in Bristol. And that's why I'm interested in taking a sociological perspective on the discipline of education, because it highlights that constant struggle, and probably more than many disciplines, it's been a struggle for itself and not always in charge of its own fate. Well, my little bit of history, parallel to what Malcolm was talking about, would be more of a national history. And there are two traditions of education in this country. One is the normal college tradition. The picture here goes, it's the Borough Road College with the teacher-pupil system in the 1790s. And that is the dominant model of teacher education from the 1790s onwards. It's where the majority of teachers were prepared in this country. The word normal college, normal, it actually comes from the French, and it's actually about a notion of a moral community. And the idea that teacher education should take place in small moral communities, usually religiously based communities, which were based on instruction and clear morality, was actually a tradition that went through the college tradition in the United Kingdom right up until the 1950s. Small, isolated communities, very often in lovely rural settings, where there was a strong moral emphasis rather than an academic and intellectual preparation. There's a minority tradition, which is the established universities starting to get involved in education. Manchester was the first university to actually start evening classes for practicing teachers in 1852. Shortly after that, Oxford did the same, a number of other universities. Then we get to the 1890s and we get the development of day training colleges, as there was in Bristol, attached to universities, which over the succeeding generation, we get to 1913, turned themselves into departments of education. And I'm sure the story that Malcolm talked about, the struggle here for that to happen, is a struggle that happened in where I'm in Oxford and in many other places, and in many ways is still going on. Scotland had a rather different tradition. It didn't have that great division. It had 7 really, really great teachers' colleges that were respected as independent and something different from a university. And they maintained that independence right up until the beginning of this century, when they were all merged into existing universities. And it's a very, very different approach to what professional education should be. In reading a bit about the history, one of the things that I was interested in learning was that there were 2 major attempts to bring the 2 parts of the education field together in the 20th century. One was in the 1920s, when the TUC and the Labour Party had it as part of their aspiration, actually in the Labour Party manifesto at one point, to combine the 2 systems, to bring teacher education fully into the university system and have it combined. What then happened was that the National Union of Teachers got involved in the general strike in 1926, and the government got really, really frightened of losing teacher education into what was then an autonomous university system. And the government of the day very quickly pushed that proposal into the long grass. It disappeared for a generation. I have a rather less positive view about the Mcnair report in 1940, published in 1945. It was looking at what are the implications for the teaching profession of having established the 44 Act, where we had free secondary education for the first time. The Mcnair report, at that time, interestingly, the government were quite relaxed about the idea of bringing these 2 major sectors of education together. And this time, it was the Vice-Chancellors, led by Mcnair, who was Vice-Chancellor of Liverpool University, who actually absolutely ran scared. They said, we don't want training involved in the university world, and we don't want that government engagement and control in the university world. And their compromise was therefore to set up these area training organisations where the old universities kind of had a controlling but rather distant relationship with their teachers' colleges in their region. So it really wasn't, well, just a little bit about research, it has rather a different history. The history of educational research, actually internationally, in the English-speaking world and beyond, goes back to Scotland, when in the 1890s, some of the benefits of the Enlightenment that had been applied to fields like medicine and agriculture would turn their attention to the field of education. A very small tradition begins there and rapidly spreads into Europe and into the States, not into England and Wales. And it's a tradition that you then see as a very, very minority tradition. What you actually get in Scotland in 1908 is that the Ed.B. or B.Ed degree, it was a second first degree for training educational researchers. Enormously influential, the people who went through that degree. A similar one was set up in Queen's in 1948. But those people were part of a very specialist and small research tradition, mainly focused on assessment, intelligence testing, those sorts of things. And it was really very separate from professional education. So those are the kind of 2 bits of history that are important, and they come together, really, in the Robbins report, immensely important. And actually we're still, I think, feeling the rollings out of what Robbins was about, 1963. It was Robbins, of course, who argued for the substantial expansion of the university system. But he also focused very specifically on teacher education as well. and was the basis of actually establishing teaching as a graduate profession. And we start then to get the Bachelor of Education degree for the first time. And the big question at the time was, if you want to make education a degree, then how do you do that? Well, one way to do it, the most important way to do that was to establish what became agreed as the disciplines of education, the sociology, psychology, philosophy, and history of education. What is fascinating about that is, firstly, that was a degree structure that was agreed across the whole of the UK. All the universities got involved, invented a new degree with a similar structure, with those 4 disciplines at the centre of it. What is also fascinating is if you go into the English-speaking world, and particularly in the Commonwealth, and scratch the surface, you will find the same degree structure in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, in Australia, in New Zealand. A similar line of thinking about how you would turn this professional area into a degree emerges then. It therefore also stimulates, from that point on, huge amounts of different sorts of research, breaking out of this fairly narrow assessment, measurement, psychological testing model into a whole range of other sorts of disciplinary areas that actually can inform and enrich education. What Robbins was also very keen was, though, is if education was going to be run at a degree level, then the teachers' institutions themselves had to have the same autonomy as institutions as the universities, and they had to have the same control of the curriculum. And he therefore recommended that they would slowly come together in regional areas. They would link up with the existing universities. They would link up with great technical colleges in our cities. And that is actually what has happened. Though he couldn't believe that he wouldn't have believed it took another 50 years for that system to work its way through. We still have Stranmillis and St Mary's colleges in Northern Ireland, and there's St Mary's in London, and there are a few religious-based institutions that maintain their autonomy, but overall, the vast majority now of teachers' colleges are fully part of autonomous institutions that are universities, constitutional universities. So a long history. Well, where are we today? Well, have I missed one? Yeah. No, I haven't missed one. There we are. I changed them around. Okay. Well, today, there are 112 university departments of education in the UK. I just divide them into 4 bits. There's the pre-92 sector, and you can divide those into departments of education, which themselves are research secure in research elite universities, and you go and visit those and you get a certain sort of feel. And you can go to old universities with a Department of Education in where the department's research is insecure, and you get a very, very different sort of feel to what those departments are like. Post-92, 92 is significant if you don't know it, because that's when we ended the binary line between the polytechnic sector and the old university sector. 1992, you go into our ex-polytechnics, you go into UE, you get a very, very different feel about what education is about. These are big civic institutions with their feet firmly in the local community, very, very diverse in terms of the student intake they have. And that affects the nature of what education becomes in those institutions. Then there's the ex-teachers' colleges. I provocatively divide them into the new entrepreneurs. There are some very, very aggressive new universities expanding in every possible way. Many of them have a teachers' college in their history, but becoming very diverse. And then you have, well, the government provocatively in their 2006 Act suggested, 2004 Act suggested there should be some universities, new universities that were teaching-only universities as well. Often quite small liberal arts colleges with education, often quite a majority of what happens in those institutions. You get different institutions with different trajectories. They have different lived realities of what it means like to study education, what it means like to be a member of staff in those institutions. And one of the things I've been doing in the last couple of years is actually taking a sample of those sorts of institutions across the country and just trying to smell how different it is to do education in different places. Okay, well, those challenges, that contested history, as we've heard here, and we've heard and nationally, hasn't gone away. Just a little aside, I was looking up for an image of School Direct, and I came across a very nice little image called Schools Direct. I thought, well, that's not right, it's not spelt right, but it looks, it was a blackboard with the word Schools Direct over it. And I thought, well, I better just check this before I use it. Schools Direct, with an S on it, and they provide curtains and blinds for schools. Direct. This is the new initiative instead. Okay. It's not, though, and I don't want to spend time talking about it in detail, but the idea where budgets move to schools in significant ways, and they buy back those services which they wish to buy back from the universities, it's a major challenge economically in all sorts of ways for departments of education in England. But it's not the only challenge. I mean, yesterday I was in Wales. I mean, the real challenge there is the absolute collapse of educational research in all but one university in the whole of Wales. I mean, it's just simply non-existent. It is quite astounding how bad it is at the moment. And also School Direct, though, has major implications for all sorts of other things beyond initial teacher education. It is 66% of the teaching student numbers in the whole of education. If you start to interrupt that, which has been a secure funding base in different forms for the last 100 years, you start to actually raise all sorts of other questions about the superstructure that's often been built on top of that in terms of higher degrees and research and things like that. So it does seem to me that from a whole variety of different ways, there are different challenges in Scotland and Northern Ireland I don't have time to go into. But the university project, what I call the project to get education fully integrated as part of the university system, I think is in serious jeopardy at this particular point. And it always seems to be a crisis, I guess, but it does seem to be a bigger one at the moment than it has done. So what do? Well, how do we rescue the university project? Continuing that contested history, I've got 5 steps. I think the first step really is to understand our current position. One of the things I've been doing is trying to get a bit of data on who education is. Second largest social science with 5,200 academic members of staff. Only 34% on teaching-only contracts nationally. That's the highest of any social science. Only 27% of those staff have doctorates. That is the lowest percentage of any social science. Our teaching is often very highly regarded indeed. Despite headlines from the current Chief Inspector, the report after report after report on the teaching quality in English institutions has been very, very positive indeed, with enormously positive feedback from students. If you look at the newly qualified teacher surveys from the early 80s, immensely hostile to what they've experienced in their teacher education. Now, it's actually 98% say their experience was good or very good. It's just quite astounding. Of course, they've got critical comments and things they want better, but the overwhelming positive response from what they've received is immensely positive. But very often, what we teach is often too instrumental, I would argue, and too narrow. So there are both good points and bad points. Our research in some of our established institutions, and this is one of them, the research base is as good as any you would find in any of the established social science disciplines. We're a rich and lively field with very good networks, but how good are we in relation to our size? And the last RAE, only a third of staff were entered. That's not to say there's not other sorts of research going, but that figure does actually matter, it seems to me. I've got to speed up. I'm running out of time. So I think we're a segmented field, segmented in terms of staffing, in terms of research, and we're often a discipline that's isolated from its neighbours. So step 2, well, we need to be clear about what our contribution is. People always use utilitarian arguments. They say, well, we're as good as doing this stuff as anybody else. I think you've actually got to do way beyond that. You've actually got to say, if universities are involved in the field of education, what is it in principle that universities have got to contribute that other people don't have? I think that knowledge isn't the answer. I think we've gone beyond that. I don't think, and this is a longer argument, but I don't think that we're in a position anymore to say that universities in any field have forms of knowledge that in principle are completely unavailable elsewhere in civil society. And that comes round as a consequence for all sorts of things were happening in the field of knowledge at the end of the last century. And I think there's a lot of insecurity now we have in particular in an applied field like education, that somehow we've got something that no one else has. But what we do have, it seems to me, is that we do have a very important, essential purpose, and that's to do with what I call the maximisation of reason or the contestability of knowledge. In our teaching, in our research, it is at the exact heart of what we do, that you must ask hard questions, you must look for evidence, you must challenge assumptions. Even though that we knowledge that we gain through that process may atrophy, may change over the successive 2 or 3 years. We know that that principle is actually really, really important. Now, school systems, industry, they also engage in research. But that notion of the contestability of knowledge is not at the heart of what that institution as a whole is about. And if you work in a university, you work in an incredibly privileged space where that is your core principle. And all of us who work in universities are immensely lucky to be able to do that. And that really, I think, is the heart of what we have to contribute. I won't go on about Martha and Esther and the humanities. They seem to be. I'll come back to them if you want to at another stage. Next question, returning for professional education. Is it still the core of what we do? Well, I still think it is a very, very important thing that may look rather different in the future. But we need very clear arguments about why universities should be involved in professional education. And there's lots of different ways of characterising it. I mean, Eric Hall from here talks about the need for extended professionality. Marion Cochrane-Smith has a similar phrase. Paul Hurst talks about, well, borrowing from Matthew Arnold, being exposed to the best that's been thought and said in education and developing practical theories. However you characterise what universities contribute, you have got to ask some hard questions about why would that be necessary? And I think one of the difficulties is actually getting the message across at the moment, because I don't think Mr. Gove is actually listening. But the argument, it seems to me, goes like this. It isn't about saying universities are important, we've got something distinctive, everyone needs extended professionality. You've got to say, what do the kids need? You start with the kids. The argument must run with them. They are entering into a world which is transforming it at such a rate in terms of knowledge, in terms of technology, in terms of diversity of values, in terms of mobility of peoples. In so many ways, they're entering into this hugely complex world. And more than ever before, they have to be educated to deal effectively with that complexity, to form their own judgments, to actually be able to understand differences in interpretations. And if they need that, then absolutely professional education needs to have that as part of what it's about. That's why extended professionality is needed, because that's what our kids need. That's not what Mr. Gove thinks education is about, but I'm absolutely convinced that's what we need. But why do universities need to be involved? Well, schools, you can't think of this stuff without thinking about schools. Absolutely essential to work in very strong collaborations. But universities do have access to other sorts of knowledge. They are repositories of the best that's been thought and said. And they have at their heart this principle of the contestability of knowledge. That's what they've got at the centre. That's what they've got to bring to that collaborative process that I think is actually unique. I've got a couple more. I'll go relatively quickly. Retooling for knowledge mobilisation. We spend about 80 million quid a year on educational research in this country. If you add up all the different sources, it's a lot of money. And our dominant rationale is that it's applied. That is a bit of a problem. Often universities don't like applied research. It's certainly not at the top of the pecking order. And then the government says, well, we're spending all this money, and if it's applied, show me the results, and that's actually very difficult to demonstrate. So we often get caught in both ways in that. If we want to win the argument, we can't wait around for what Carol Weiss, Sociology of Knowledge, talks about as knowledge creep. She says after 25 years, research changes the questions. We can't hang around for that, it seems to me. Much government policy follows arguments put forward by Michael Gibbons, David Hargreaves, notions of where institutions like universities are left out of the picture, increasingly in terms of government policy for innovation and development. So if we want to continue with our research, we have to do much more about showing its value. We have to do much more about mobilising it. And we have to think much more hard about knowledge mobilisation. There's lots and lots of experience in education about the value of action research, but it's not the only answer. We learned a lot from the Teaching and Learning Research Programme about how to get practitioners and policymakers involved in forming questions in the first place, in developing research ideas, in collaborating. Lots of stuff there. What we're much worse at is actually engaging with knowledge brokers. Ministers don't listen to individual researchers, but they do listen to think tanks, they listen to advisory bodies, they listen to all those intermediary bodies, and we actually, as the field, need to get much sharper about working with them to get our messages out. It's something I'm doing at the moment with the RSA, it's about that. And we also need to think about, well, we've got the government's, the structures right, there's still very hard edges, despite very good partnerships, there are still very hard edges around institutions like this. And I think it's actually worth having some thoughts about, in the future, whether schools of education, as in other disciplines, actually need to think about how they would govern themselves in different ways to break down some of those boundaries. Final one, retooling for research. We've got to carry on getting better, developing a broad base of research methods, especially quantitative methods. This department has a strong track record in quantitative research, but it's very much a minority. And it, like it or not, is absolutely the flavour of what the government's listening to. It's vitally important that all of us get much more involved in that. We need to be less exclusive, and we've got to broaden our research agenda. There are major educational research questions about all of that lot. What is depressing is that if you're doing something on ageing, an interdisciplinary project on ageing funded by a government, would they turn to educationalists to answer the education dimensions of that interdisciplinary problem? If we go into the economy, there are educational dimensions there. There's educational dimensions all over the place. Are we in the game of actually helping to shape interdisciplinary teams answering those major questions? I don't know that we are sufficiently. Okay, the research agenda is changing, impact's not going to go away, and the EU particularly, and following on from the ESRC, is really pushing. They're saying that social problems don't fit neatly into disciplines. You've got to be interdisciplinary. You've got to be transdisciplinary. So you've actually got to contribute to the fact that you actually contribute to those agendas, it seems to me. Finally, you've got to recognise the centrality of research in the university project. It seems to me that only if faculties of education develop a strong and inclusive research culture, as this one does, can we ensure that that idea of the maximisation of reason, that idea of contestability of knowledge, is at the heart of what the University Department of Education can contribute. And every time we casualise staff on the front line, every time we put people on contracts that exclude them from that scholarly culture, that figure of 34% of our discipline is on temporary teaching-only contracts, is really, really significant here. Every time you do that, that undermines universities' ability to say, we've got something essentially distinctive to contribute. Just to conclude with this little quote from Robert Pirsig. He says, rescuing the university project, he says, the real university is a state of mind. It has that great heritage of rational thought that's been brought down to us through the centuries. It doesn't exist in any specific location. It's a state of mind which is regenerated throughout the centuries by a body of people who traditionally carry the title of lecturer or professor. But even that title is not part of the real university. The real university is nothing less than the continuing body of reason itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. There's a lot for us to take away from that, I think. I'll hand straight over to Kai to help us get a global perspective on all of this, because I think in the school we're trying to take some of those challenges seriously that John's raised for us. So Kai, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Keri. I did both my MEd and PhD at the School of Education here. So this experience has always been a very important part of my life, and it's a great honor for me to speak on such a special occasion. I would say it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so thank you very much for inviting me. So my topic today is about teacher education in China, past, present, and future. So I only have 5 minutes. I will just give a succinct introduction about teacher education in China. over the past few decades, like the situation in many other developing countries, a number of normal schools in China, as well as as well as normal colleges in China, have been upgraded into higher education or higher learning institutions. This is a major threat in the development of teacher education in China. Normal schools, here normal I would say, like what John said, is more like normative. So that's why the Chinese discourse of teacher education sticks to normal. In Chinese we call it 师范. 师范 means teacher model. So that has some implications about training teachers not only to teach, but also be a role model for their students. We can divide the development of teacher education in the past half century in China into 3 periods. The first one is the period of 师范, or normal schools and universities, when teacher education was offered exclusively by 师范 universities or 师范 schools. The next era is the post 师范 or post-normal schools or universities period. In this period, not only teacher education was offered in 师范 universities or schools, but also they were offered in many other non-normal institutions. So this is more like a diversity of teacher education and training in China. And also, this means that there have been more players in the governance of teacher education. And now we are actually coming to the third era of professional teacher education, which is there will be professional teacher education offered at some schools of education in more comprehensive universities. So this is like normal universities in China are becoming comprehensive. That means they not only train teachers, they also educate their students to become other professionals. While in the meantime, comprehensive universities in the traditional sense are training teachers as well. So this is the third era. My conclusions will be threefold. The first one is, in the past half century, the closed old teacher education system is being transformed into a more open system to meet the needs in China's development for more high caliber teachers. And then the second conclusion would be the long-term goal in teacher training education in China is to educate the prospective teachers in professional schools education at universities. That means there will be more school of education or department of education in comprehensive universities, which was not the case in the past. This also raises another question, that is, what role will the school education in a normal university play, like my institution? I work with a school of education or at a normal university. So what role will we play in this new era? And the last one is a prediction. So teacher education in China will be delivered increasingly at graduate school level in the future to produce more high quality teachers for the development of economy and society in China. So that's a brief account of teacher education in China, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Interesting parallels and issues for us to think about there. So, and finally, and fittingly, Julian.
I'm not quite sure what fittingly means. Good morning, everybody. I noticed on the blurb that we got sent out that Kai and I would be exploring the international and local perspectives on the future of teacher education. I presume Kai's done the international bit and I'm doing the local bit. But actually, I'd actually emphasise that I think there's a lot of synchronicity between the two. And I was on the DFE research visit to Shanghai and Ningbo at the start of the year, and it was actually reassuring and fascinating to see that the priorities and what they're aiming to do in schools in China and teacher education is exactly the sort of things we are aiming to do in our very local school, which is Backwell. I'm just going to talk to you a bit about Backwell School as well, but there is a reason for that. Backwell School is a teaching school, so it heads up the North Somerset Teaching Alliance. And we recently had an Ofsted inspection that was pretty hard work, but we were judged to be outstanding in all categories, and that's the second outstanding we've had in a row, which in itself under the current framework is unusual. The reason I'm saying that is not because I want the round of applause, but one of the grades is for quality of teaching, and that was judged to be outstanding, and that's the starting point, because the reason for the success of Backwell School is because historically we have focused and valued teachers in terms of their ongoing improvement, encouraging, challenging and enabling them to improve, not just in their first year, not just in their training, but not just in their NQT year, but right through. But we've still got a way to go, and that is one area I was inspired by my visit to China. I'll edit my notes out because I would like to open up the session for debate as well. But you don't need me to tell you that education at all levels, as been referred to before, from Sure Start right through to higher education, is going through a change. It's a tumultuous change in terms of organisation, funding and expectations. And we saw Michael Gove before, there's no point in hoping, assuming that these changes will stop or be reversed at the end of the current government and Secretary of State's term of office. They won't. We are on the road. In terms of teacher education, there's a perceptible shift from higher education to schools, particularly through the setup and development of the ever-increasing number of teaching schools, of which Backwell is one. Charlie Taylor, the Chief Executive of the National College for Teaching Leadership, said last week that they are now on track to achieve their target 500 teaching schools in the country. Now that's leading 500 teaching alliances. Let's assume there's 20 fairly active, engaged schools in each alliance. That's 10,000 schools already actively involved in developing and modifying their roles in what they do. So that's a massive shift. The theory of teaching schools and alliances is that they're allowed, not actually encouraged, to set things up to address their own local agenda. Now, the cynic might say that's an easy get-out for the National College, and that's probably the reason why there's a continual lack of clear guidance that we get. There's short-termism, and it's handed over to us. If you can combine that deliberate absence of standardisation with the idiosyncratic attitude of teachers, of which I am as guilty as any, you do have, the result you get is you're going to have very different arrangements in different parts of the country, in neighbouring parts of the country, depending on local needs and the aspirations of schools, of those schools. So for the rest of this particular talk, I'm talking from a local perspective. It's our own perspective at Backwell and North Somerset and our links with Bristol University, which are very strong. Teacher education starts with ITE, teacher education, of course. I want to focus on School Direct. We've had we've heard about that already, and it's happening. Schools such as Backwell, we have a massive acquisition of experience and expertise in teacher training and professional development. And we do believe that School Direct offers us the opportunity to have a greater amount of planning and delivery into the teacher recruitment and training. It will enable us to grow our own, if you like, through identification of what we're going to need in the future. So I'm trying to work out what our needs will be in 2 or 3 years' time. And the development of training within their own ethos. So if you like, bespoke training. But obviously within the parameters of common standards and expectations. The situation is different in different parts of the country, different schools, but it is not in our case and the Alliance case a case of the school going solo. Our school and those in the Alliance have strong reciprocal links with universities such as Bristol, and particularly in terms of institute of training, Bristol is the main collaborative partner. And this is to the benefit of the trainees. Now, in my view, this collaboration needs to be continued, but inevitably under schemes such as School Direct, the nature of that collaboration is going to be reviewed. It is being reviewed now as we speak, and it's going to be recalibrated. The school is going to take an increasing lead in planning delivery of training while utilising the expertise in pedagogical theory and practice that the university has. Our Alliance has a constitution, and officially Bristol University is designated a strategic partner, and that's exactly what it is. It's what it says on the tin. It's strategic and it's a partner. Before I leave any strategic training, I want to make two contextual comments as well, because I realise it is an issue of concern and possibly controversial. Firstly, School Direct is not replacing PGCE. It's running alongside, and the two will continue to run alongside, but I think the numbers will move towards greater amount of school-based training, because schools will be further empowered, and inevitably, although we're not in this position that we don't want to go there yet, schools are being encouraged to take up even licensing to accredit qualifications themselves. The second point is that our school doesn't just have a partnership with Bristol, it values it. And as the IT programmes are planned to develop with greater emphasis on school-based training, that partnership will develop and evolve. And that's probably why I'm invited here today, because that's our standpoint. But it's not necessarily the case in all alliances. And there are other alliances, even in this area, that perhaps have a different view to ours. And that's part of the fragmentation of the system. And interesting, talking to Kai earlier on, my experiences in Shanghai, there's one major difference between our system and other systems, that our system in education system, as you know, in all areas, is fragmenting. And that's a policy, but it doesn't, I'm not convinced it makes it more effective or easier. But of course, no teacher is fully developed after 1 year. I think this really comes on from what we've heard from other speakers. We've never assumed that after 1 year an NQT has got it. Actually, I'm not here all day. This afternoon, because I'm still teaching, I'm actually, as part of our peer observation programme, I'm watching a teacher in her third year of teaching. We both teach Spanish. And I really need to improve my understanding of how to use the interactive whiteboard. So I'll be in her lesson at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And that is an attitude that we are encouraging. It's a very simplistic example. But there is a need for all teachers to carry on developing in theoretical and in practical areas. And that, I think, underpins the outstanding judgment we've had in the last 2 inspections. But we've got a long way to go there. And one of the messages that I got from China was the amazing emphasis on CPD for teachers, not just in their first year. I think, Kai, we were told that it wasn't even assumed that a teacher was nearly there until they'd been at least 5 years teaching. Now, you talk to a teacher who's been 5 years teaching in our country, and they probably think they're there. And that is a mentality that we want to develop and amend. In China, for example, or certainly in Shanghai, all teachers are contractually expected to do at least 1, preferably 2 research projects a year as part of their CPD. Fantastic. It could be action research within the school, or it could be outside and report back. That is something we're bringing into our school, both at Teaching Alliance level, because we've drawn down funding from National College, and we've got 4 research projects going on, but also within our own school. And I am finding time and money to, I can't get all teachers doing that, but some teachers will be doing research projects next year as their own CPD. That's really an area in which I think, which we can see a developing relationship with the university. The School of Education is involved in our research projects already because of the wealth of experience and expertise that is there. And we want to use that. It's also an area the University School of Education can help us develop our teachers through improving their level of qualification. I'm not a great fan of PISA rankings. It's a very limited measure, but two countries, very different systems, China and Finland, and they are radically different, are right at the top. But what they've got in common is their emphasis on high quality teachers, well-educated teachers. And that is an area that we want to continue to develop, whether it's a master's, which we referred to briefly, or placements at university. So, in my view, to sum up very quickly, universities such as Bristol should play a significant role in the future of teacher education, both initial and ongoing. That's in the interests of our current and future teachers, which, yeah, ultimately is the interests of our children, because that's what we're there for. But I think their relationship with schools is going to become more collaborative. It must become more collaborative. And I think the universities will need to become more responsive to what the more autonomous schools want and need, and also be more proactive in what they have to offer. And it's really refreshing that I don't think that contradicts anything I've heard from the other speakers today.